last day we'll have a formal presentation, so you can kind of think of tomorrow as when the weekend starts. And I want to talk to you today, a lot of the things we're going to be looking at, rather than culture or history or politics, will be about the environment. And I think, you know, this is what I've been writing about in this book recently, and I was going to change the presentation I usually give here because you're a little younger, but I actually think you're all so intelligent, I haven't changed it very much. I've changed it a little. And it's a presentation about ecological restoration. Have any of you ever heard of ecological restoration? No? And can everyone see the screen? Should I move it a little? It's okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about ecological restoration, and I'll explain in a minute what it means, or something about what it means. But just, these are the ideas of it. But first, our Irish lesson. Who can remember how to say hello? Great! Great! Christine, do you remember? Yeah, good. Now, I think there's been a development in ecological restoration. Instead of thinking of a pristine past, we're thinking of a better future. But in basic terms, ecological restoration, when I heard this phrase, and it's an awkward phrase. It's not a phrase I terribly like, but I spent 10 years researching the book, and I couldn't find a better phrase. It's a phrase that is generally used. But to me, when I first heard the phrase, it was a big surprise. Because restoration, to me, is something you do to a house, or to a car, or to a painting. It's basically taking something that is damaged or has become in some way old or needs to be refreshed and making it new again. But the idea to me that you could do this to an ecosystem, that you could do this to a landscape, that was completely, it went against everything I understood. And I think that many of us, we are taught that there are two things that humans do with nature. One is we develop, and develop means to some degree destroy or degrade, certainly change quite radically. Well, the other thing we do is preserve. And this is the classic national park model, especially in North America and in Africa, countries which were colonized, interestingly. This is where the model of a national park comes from. And the national park, the idea is you build a fence, you remove the native people, and you say, this is nature. This is nature in its pure, pristine state, if you like. And we just leave it alone, and the only people who go there are scientists and tourists. That's the classic national park. And that's kind of the classic preservation, conservation model. What restoration suggests, and it's a very new science, it's only about 40 years old, is that we can actually have an active engagement with nature, that we interact with nature, that we don't leave things alone. If you look out the window now, most of you can see, you see that beautiful kind of purple flower?
Yes.
In the trees, and if you look around, it's everywhere. It's down the river. Now, this is a very beautiful plant. It's called rhododendron. I'm sure you have some of it in the Basque Country. Rhododendron is a beautiful plant, but here it is a big problem. Because if rhododendron comes into our oak forests, it spreads very rapidly, it covers everything, and no new plants can grow under it. And basically, it kills the oak forest. And this is a very common problem around the world. You take a plant from one place where it may have quite a small population, and you put it somewhere else, and for a series of biological reasons it spreads very fast and it destroys the native vegetation. And so if we made a national park across, there's oak forest, really good oak forest across the river, but it's dying. It's dying because it's full of rhododendron. So we can't leave it alone. We have to manage it. If we want to keep an oak forest, if we want to restore an oak forest, we've got to get rid of the rhododendron. Get rid of, you understand? Kita. And it's really difficult to get rid of rhododendron. You cut it down, you burn it, you poison it, and it still comes back. It's really hard to get rid of. And it's actually one of those plants that you could say that plants have their own intelligence. It actually changes the soil, chemically changes the soil, so that native plants find it very difficult to grow where there has been rhododendron. It can take 10 or 20 years for the soil to be restored. So I found this idea that you could restore the environment a very encouraging idea, because I think that most of what we hear about the environment is always bad news. It's always catastrophe, it's extinction, it's climate change, etc., etc. And I think many people just feel despair, or they feel this is such a big problem, we can do nothing about it. To me, the beautiful thing about restoration is you can, I obviously haven't done it very effectively, but I can go out there and I can do something about that rhododendron. It gives everybody a chance to engage in a place that historically, and usually what we're looking for is the most diverse, where you have the biggest variety, because that's the greatness of evolution, is the variety of species we get. If you let rhododendron everywhere, you only have one species. You're reducing the diversity of life. So, I want to give you an example of a really remarkable restoration project. This is a mine in southwest Australia. It's run by a big aluminium corporation. So they're mining for bauxite, which is the raw material for aluminium. And they dig here, they knock down, this is a very, very rich in species eucalyptus forest. And they knock down the forest, they dig 4 meters deep. And if you dig 4 meters deep, in fact if you dig 6 inches deep, there is very little life left. The first 6 inches of the soil is full of microbial life. Tiny animals, tiny plants. And that is the basis of all life on Earth. So you take that 6 inches away, then you take 4 meters away, you've virtually got no life at all. So you're, if you like, at ground zero. 20 years later, they've restored it to that. Now, I hope you're skeptical. You should always be skeptical about everything you are told. Many mining companies do this kind of thing as a public relations exercise. So you might look at that and think, yeah, but that's all the same kind of tree. It's not the forest that was there before. Well, no, it's not the forest that was there before, because for a start, it's all 4 meters lower down. And we don't know in the long term the impacts of that. But the incredible thing here is this is one of the most biodiverse places in the world, where you have the most species literally per square meter. And within 20 years, they are getting back 98% of the species. And the 2% they're not getting back is mainly because some animals, birds, reptiles, insects, need old wood. They need dead wood. And in a 20-year-old forest, there's not much dead wood. So they're now actually bringing in dead wood in order to get those species back. Now, this is a really remarkable thing. It's very unusual. Mining corporations don't usually do this. But for a series of reasons, which I don't have time to explain now, this corporation in this place has decided to do this. And they decided to invest seriously in it. But what's interesting is that you might think this costs a lot of money, and it does. It costs millions. But it only costs 1% of this company's profit from this site. So it's a very small environmental tax for an incredible result. And this company, as I say, is doing it voluntarily. The state regulation is much lower. This is a very high standard. So that's just to give you an example of what can be done with restoration. And again, I think it's encouraging, it's good news that if we began to invest in the environment, in the way we invest in roads and hospitals and schools, which are good things, I guess, certainly if we began to invest 1% of what we invest in weapons to kill each other, I mean, the investment in the armaments industry is enormous. We could do a great deal to solve our environmental problems. I'm not saying all of them, but it's just an example of what can be done if there was a serious intention to do it. What I'm saying is environmental problems can be solved, but there has to be the political, the social will to do it. I'm just going to take you now, because we'll be going to, the next thing we do today is we go to a forest, an oak forest, which is the landscapes they were seeing were perfect, untouched. All these people do is hunt and fish and gather vegetables and seeds, so they don't change the landscape. But the more we learn about, for example, the countries that Spain colonized in Latin America, is that they were very heavily populated, and they changed, the people who lived in those environments changed them greatly. And basically what happened is we European settlers, killed some of these people, and then we killed most of them with disease. Their population crashed. And so many of the kind of monuments to their civilization and the changes they made disappeared. But to give you one example, there's a national park called Yosemite in California. Do any of you know it? Very, very beautiful park. Well, it was one of the first national parks in the world. And they made that national park. Who made that national park? The US Cavalry, the US Army. The first thing they did was they sent in the US Army, and they told the Native American peoples who lived there to go away. Go to the reservation. Go to a concentration camp, effectively. And they thought they were preserving nature. They thought that everything they were seeing had been created by God, and that there was nothing made by humans there. And they weren't even really aware of how the park was changing until 50 years later they brought the Native Americans back, just to look at the park, not to live there. And the Native Americans said, "Why have you let the park get so dirty? Why have you let it get so untidy?" And the park authorities were horrified. They said, "We have preserved it perfectly." And the Native Americans said, "No, you haven't. The valley should be a savanna. Now it's all full of trees. It's a forest." So what the white people had not understood was that for many centuries, the Native Americans had burned the valley, deliberately burned the valley to change that environment. Because many Native American peoples like savanna. A savanna where you just have a few trees and a lot of grassland, it's very good for hunting. It's hard to hunt in the forest. You can't see the animals. You create a savanna and they get bison, they get buffalo, they get antelope, etc., etc. So there was this misconception about what landscapes really were. So there was also a rather religious idea that somehow, especially in America, that this was God's own country, that this was kind of the Garden of Eden. If you read the early American English, the Anglo settlers in North America, they talk very much as if they're finding paradise again. And I say it was this misunderstanding. So they had this kind of, these kind of paintings of a vision of paradise, but with no people there. But actually that was never, since we evolved as a species and spread around the world, that has never been typical of nature. And here's a question. Is there a parallel with nationalism here? If you look at the early Basque nationalism or early Irish nationalism, there is this tendency to imagine an ideal past, to think that before the English came to Ireland, everything was perfect. Before there were Spanish immigrants in Bilbao, it was a pure Catholic Basque-speaking city. So there's this creation of an ideal past. As I say, in Ireland, the idea of a land of saints and scholars. So you completely distort the actual history with an ideal. You say there was a land of saints and scholars, and you forget that it was actually a land of warfare. There may have been some saints, and there were certainly some scholars, but there were an awful lot of warlords fighting with each other. So, and it's a natural thing. I think all nationalisms do this in their first phase. What's interesting then is as nationalisms evolve and grow more mature, they actually become more pluralistic, and they recognize that the past was more complex than they said it was. I mean, there is an Irish nationalist phrase, for example, 800 years of occupation. And that gives you the idea as if the British had been occupying all of Ireland for 800 years. Well, in fact, it wasn't the British in the first place. It was the Normans. And what role should human beings play in the landscape? And slightly more humorously, what do we do when we can't find paradise? But I think at least we try to make things a little better.